Get us to our incredible, unique introduction to Star Wars.
To Star Wars. And this all happened, Kansas City successfully bid for the 1976 World Science Fiction Convention. We won our convention at Discon 2 in 1974. And for the next 2 years, organizing the WorldCon was my full-time job. My other full-time job.
What else were you doing?
Well, I worked at Hallmark Cards in the lettering department as a production artist, and that's where actually the Star Wars story began. Nice lead-in. Early 1976, and my memory was that it was very early February, maybe late January of 1976. One of our secretaries in the main office area in the lettering department came back to me and says, "You have a phone call from Hollywood that had come in through the main phone up front." Now we of course had our own extensions, but the phone call had come in there. So I walked up there and I said, "Hollywood? Well, this is." I said, "Wonder what this is about."
Brilliant.
Well, I didn't realize that what was going to happen next would be quite a significant event. Well, I pick up the phone, and on the phone is an operator.
Frankly, you didn't know how significant for probably a while after it happened.
Until after it happened.
Yeah.
Until it all fell into perspective. On the phone was an operator, and she says, "Please hold for Charles Lippincott." Now, Charles Lippincott was the vice president of publicity and promotion at 20th Century Fox for a film that you might have heard of called, in those days it was called The Star Wars.
Right.
With "the" in front of it.
Yeah.
And over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, he began to pitch a proposal to me that the longer it went along, the more I couldn't believe what I was being pitched. Now, let me stop here for a moment and explain that I knew who George Lucas was at that time because one of the first science fiction films I saw when I moved to Kansas City was THX 1138, his first feature film, his first science fiction film. And of course, I'd been in the audience the weekend that American Graffiti had opened to huge applause, and it was a huge hit. So of course I was aware who George Lucas was because I had been reading in the science fiction trade magazines like Cinefantastique and Fantastic Films of this new film that Lucas was developing for 20th Century Fox. Now, originally, he had wanted to do Flash Gordon, the classic Alex Raymond newspaper comic strip. But the rights to that had already been tied up some time ago, and so he couldn't do Flash Gordon. So he had this other idea that he pitched to 20th Century Fox. It was a kind of a space opera, and he called it The Star Wars. And they gave it the green light, and it went into production. Now, when I got this phone call, the film was finishing up principal photography in Tunisia and other parts of the country. The special effects had not yet been done, and they would be done starting in the fall of 1976. What Lippincott proposed to me was he asked if we would be interested in a multimedia presentation about George Lucas's new science fiction film and a display of all the props, original production art by Ralph McQuarrie, stills, costumes, etc. from Lucas's new film. Well, this was pretty exciting news, and I didn't really know how exciting until after I sat in the theater with everyone else and saw the film. So I said, well, I'll have to get back to you on this, Charles, because I'll have to run this past the committee for their approval. But I was pretty excited about this idea.
Oh, imagine if they'd said
at that point, he was dangling the fact that George Lucas might actually come to the convention.
And that never happened.
Well, that didn't happen, but Gary Kurtz, the producer of the film, and Mark Hamill, and Lippincott himself actually came to the convention. So it was the next.
Yes, that's almost good enough.
Almost good enough. So over the course of the next several months, we corresponded, talked to each other on the phone, and yes, I did get the committee to come on board with this idea because basically it wasn't going to cost us anything. They were going to pay for everything. They would rent their own security for the exhibit, the Star Wars exhibit. All we had to do is provide them with time to do the presentation, and they estimated that the slideshow presentation would take about a half an hour, and then they would do a half hour or so of questions and answers from the audience.
Wow.
Seemed like a reasonable expectation. Now, I should explain to your listeners that having a major Hollywood production come to Worldcon was not a new idea. It had happened rarely, but it had happened. Gene Roddenberry had brought the Star Trek pilot to the Worldcon.
Oh, so the cage was at Worldcon.
So it was at the 1966 Worldcon in Cleveland.
I knew it had been somewhere, but I didn't realize that's where it was.
And there were also
Very
screenings going back to 1951 in the New Orleans first New Orleans Worldcon. of Day the Earth Stood Still, and I believe When Worlds Collide had both of those had been.
But now we're talking about actual screening,
actual film screenings at those conventions. Now, of course, Star Wars was still in production, but these.
So this was just a rough slideshow.
This was going to be a rough slideshow, but it was going to be more than anything I had anticipated.
Yeah.
So he explained that. The first thing I asked was, "Will the film be ready, and can we get an advanced preview screening of the film?" Because I was already thinking we were set up for 35 millimeter. We were the first Worldcon to actually have full theater capability. We put on a huge science fiction film festival retrospective as part of our Worldcon, the only Worldcon that's ever done it. And we were set up for full 35 millimeter CinemaScope screens, stereophonic sound. We could have shown, if Star Wars had been ready, we could have shown Star Wars.
What was your seating capacity, do you remember?
The Grand Ballroom probably sat 350, now for a
Did you fill it for Star Wars?
Yes. Well, the main ballroom where we did now, our film room was the Grand Ballroom. Our main ballroom where we did the presentation probably easily sat 500, maybe 550.
And did you fill it?
Yes, we did. And leading up to that, now already in production at that time I was working on, with three friends of mine, a multimedia presentation called Image and Emblem in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. This was a dissection and analysis of that time, the greatest science fiction film that had ever been made.
And it had been out for how many years?
Since 1968. So it had been in the ether for about almost 8 years. And there had never been a critical analysis breaking down what the film is really all about. And some people say it's about nothing, there's no plot to it. Well, they're totally wrong. As an authority on 2001, I can tell you there's a lot of stuff going on in 2001 that most people don't realize until you point it out to them. And that was the whole point of this presentation, was to present this multimedia presentation on Kubrick's masterpiece. Now, I will say that Charles Lippincott and 20th Century Fox weren't at all happy about having to follow us with,
I bet not.
Because here we were following one of the lionized great science fiction films that had won the Hugo Award and won several Oscars. And
here they are taking this huge gamble.
And they're taking this huge gamble on this science fiction film that nobody knows anything about. Well, I knew a little bit about it from whatever had been released. And they tried to convince us that let us move in first. And I said, you don't understand. You're going to have a built-in ready audience who've just seen a slide presentation. There's going to be a break, and then they'll come back and see the Star Wars.
Because importantly, nobody else knew about it either, and so you might not have been able to get a crowd for it.
If you were paying attention, if you were a science fiction film fan, and you were reading the popular science fiction journals like Cinefantastique and Fantastic Films and a few others, you were aware of it. And if you read any of the other journals, you were aware that George Lucas was working on a big science fiction film. But you have to understand that science fiction in the 1950s was not like science fiction today. There were a handful of films done in the 1970s, most of them bad. Most of them are unremarkable. Some of them had done a little bit of business, some hadn't.
You have some standouts like Logan's Run and things like that.
You had Logan's Run, and you had the Omega Man. You had several others. One of mine,
Soylent Green, I think was 70s, was it not?
Yes, based on Harry Harrison's novel, which is a terrible adaptation.
Yeah, I didn't care for it either.
Soylent Green.
I heard the recent remake was okay. I didn't see it, but
well, that's a whole other story.
Okay. We'll talk about that one of these days. Yeah,
I would say it's better, but it's not any better.
Oh, really? Okay.
In my opinion,
I haven't really seen it. I just heard it was better. Yeah.
But let's say it's different. It follows the original novel a little more closely.
Okay.
The Omega Man did not. Anyway, we're getting off track.
Yeah, no, we are. I was just Go ahead.
So I finally convinced them that the 2001 presentation was going to be coming first, because we had the ballroom, the Imperial Ballroom at the Milbach Hotel, was the biggest facility we had available, and it sat, if we opened up the attached Trianon room, you could probably sit 575, 600 people, and that's exactly what we did. We opened it and packed it with seating. And the Star Wars presentation played to a packed house. And I think largely that's because our 2001 presentation played to a packed house and was very well received. We took a 10-minute break after the presentation was finished. They came in. I remember talking to Lippincott and Gary Kurtz briefly. What we talked about, I don't remember. It's been too long ago.
Yeah.
But we talked about briefly what they were going to do, and I suggested, since this was an open-ended event, that if the question and answers went a little bit longer, that would be okay. They could run over. Yeah, I said I'd leave it up to you guys when to cut things off. Well, when it began, the ballroom was packed solid. I think there might have been one or two seats in the house. Apparently, enough of science fiction fandom was aware of Star Wars and Lucas to be able to pack the house for this. Now, I have to understand, it had been many years, ever since started in 1966, 10 years, since Hollywood had brought a major something to Worldcon. And in addition to this, I should point out that...
And ironic that it was Star Wars after Star Trek.
Yeah, and remember, leading up to this, there was a whole display room right upstairs near our film room that had the Star Wars display. In that room, we had Ralph McQuarrie's original production artwork. We had R2-D2, C-3PO, Darth Vader, all the costumes. I had lightsabers. The only thing we didn't have out was Chewbacca. The Chewbacca outfit was there, but we'd already rented the largest mannequin in Kansas City to put out the Darth Vader costume, and it was the full costume, including lightsaber hanging from his belt.
Well, that's the one you want.
That's the one you want.
I mean, Chewbacca's great, but that's the one you want.
Yeah, it had a couple of display cases that had other props. Had Han Solo's, blaster, and a couple of the other lightsabers, and I got to handle some of the actual prop lightsabers.
I bet people were blown away by that stuff.
Well, yes, they weren't expecting it, and I'm convinced that the large crowd, because there was a continuous crowd going through the whole convention. And I think that probably more than anything piqued people's curiosity and brought them to the Star Wars slideshow. And I have to tell you a great story.
Yeah.
Hollywood sent so much stuff for this display, we couldn't put it all out. We only could put out about 2/3 of it. And if I'd known that, I would have just simply moved to the larger room next door, which was bigger, and we could have put more stuff out. But, they were satisfied that there was enough stuff out to promote the film. There was a nice color banner with the old Star Wars graphics. If you know anything about the history of Star Wars, the early Star Wars graphics were different than what we saw later. But we had the old Star Wars banners hanging up, and they had the room draped in various colored curtains.
Now, by that point, the logo was just Star Wars. It wasn't the
It had a triangular logo, and it had some figures with lightsabers fighting, and they were indistinct. They were drawn by Ralph McQuarrie. They were not the actors themselves. In that display room, we had the first Star Wars collectibles ever offered. There was the "May the Force Be With You" blue button, and I still have mine.
Oh, so they were selling things?
No, these were given away.
Oh, they were given away?
They were giving away these
Wow.
buttons. And they also had a handout on the Star Wars, a mimeographed flyer handout. Well, fortunately, when I was up there, I made certain that I grabbed one of those. By the time I got up to the room, though, the poster, the first Star Wars poster, was gone. They brought 500 copies and they just evaporated. They were gone instantly. But I was able to pick up a button and the Star Wars flyer, and I have both of those.
You still have it?
I still have those.
Cool.
Yes. And I wouldn't part with them for anything because they're my connection to Star
Now,
Wars.
do you have much of a Star Wars collection?
I have some.
As a collector?
I
know you have a couple lightsabers and things.
I have 5 of the Master Replicas lightsabers. I just recently bought an R2-D2 popcorn holder, for your home theater.
Oh, really?
Because it was cute.
That's cool.
I've got.
Is that like an old thing or is that recent?
Oh, that's fairly recent. Yeah,
Okay.
you can still buy those. I bought it off of eBay.
Fun.
I have an R2-D2 telephone. Which originally I was going to put out on my desk, and being the collector, I said, no, it's going to stay in its package in my Star Wars collection.
Of course. I can't help but take cool things like that out of the package.
Well, I did take it out and say, oh, wow, this is really neat. And I plugged it in.
Promptly put it back in.
No, I picked it up, and it actually worked. I actually made a phone call on it, and then I promptly, very carefully wrapped it up the way it was packed.
How
and put
old
it
was
back.
that?
Oh, it probably came out in the 80s.
Okay.
Sometime.
That's fun.
You can still find them on eBay though, and they're still reasonable. You can probably pick them up for about $40 if you want to have
that's great.
have a push button, R2-D2 telephone. I've often thought about getting one so that I could have R2-D2 sitting on my desk. Because let's face it, he's become an iconic robot like C-3PO and like Robbie the Robot and Gorge and a lot of the other.
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is
Yeah.
that you saw all these really iconic things before you had any idea how iconic they were.
Yeah,
I
I'm going to give him. Here's my great story, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm helping Charles Lippincott. We had a setup area across the hall from where the Star Wars display room was going to be, and I was helping them unpack stuff. He just asked me, he said, "Would you like to help us unpack this stuff?" Because they were a little short-handed. And I said, "Sure." I said, "If you have the time." And I said, "I got the time. Trust me." So he said, "Start with that one." And they pried open this wooden crate, and in the bottom of this crate is sand. And it's Tunisian sand. Some of the stuff had come directly from the site in Tunisia. And I wish I'd had the presence of mind to scoop up some of that sand and actually have some sand from Star Wars, But of course I didn't. But I reached in and I picked up this fairly large wrapped package. It was very padded. I opened it up, and it was this big black helmet. And I looked at this thing. I said, "Man, this must be the bad guy." And he says, "Yes, that's Darth Vader." I was holding in my hand one of the original David Prowse worn Darth Vader helmets. And of course, then that had no real resonance and wouldn't for some time to come. And so I carefully handed it to him, and they were assembling Darth Vader before they took him over to put him on display. Now, also, I helped unpack the Wookiee costume. And the Wookiee costume, Chewbacca is even bigger than Darth Vader. And at that point, we'd rented the biggest mannequin in Kansas City, as I said earlier, to put out the Wookiee costume. So we couldn't put out the Wookiee costume. So I made the suggestion. Well, we did have some head mannequins. I said, let's just put out the headpiece, And we put it on one of the headpieces, and of course the eyes are all black, and the hair hanging down. And I looked at it and I said, I don't know, that might scare some of the people's kids who are at this convention, because it looked like a decapitated head sitting there on a. So we decided not to put Chewbacca's head out in the display room. So unfortunately, that's one of the things I wish we could have put out. Was we could have had Chewbacca standing there with Darth Vader, but we did have C-3PO, we did have R2-D2, we did have Darth Vader. We had various elements of the Empire and the Rebel Alliance, various costume pieces and so forth. We had all of Ralph Query's beautiful original production artwork hanging on the walls, the original Star Wars graphics, this little display table that gave out the merchandise, and both Gary Kurtz and Charles Lippincott and what's his name? Plays Luke Skywalker.
Mark Hamill.
Mark Hamill, yeah. Excuse me. We're both there periodically during the Star Wars display, and it ran for almost 2 days before they did the Star Wars slide presentation. And as I said earlier, I'm convinced that's what convinced a lot of people to go to it, because when I walked into the back of the ballroom I thought I could get a seat, somewhere near the front. The place was packed solid. And I was stunned. I said, wow, this is a big turnout. And I walked up, about 5 minutes before the show started, and I said, well, I asked Charles, I said, are you guys okay? And he says, it couldn't have gone better. Thank you so much. This was a great position to be in. And over the next half hour, the slideshow was, and this is where it really gets interesting. Yeah. The slideshow was not just a quick overview of the story. It was the exact story from opening frame to the very last frame in complete detail, illustrated with production drawings, sketches, whatever was available to illustrate the text. So everyone in that audience...
Was it accompanied with music?
No, there was no music. It was strictly narration.
Okay.
It was because in fact, I think Williams is probably still composing the music at that point. There was no music available. But what was astonishing was that by the end of that presentation, you knew the entire story in detail of the first Star Wars film.
Can you believe they spoiled it like that?
And I thought to myself, I kind of thought that. I said, well, I hope that isn't too much of a spoiler.
Yeah.
And everyone sat very carefully. They're very polite. And as soon as the presentation ended, the hands started to go up. And I will say some of the fans were fairly tough on them. They wanted to know this, they wanted to know that. They wanted to, they were most concerned about the tone of the film. Would it be respectful of science fiction, or would it be just a kiddie film? And to them, it looked like a kiddie film.
So they were interested.
So they were definitely interested in it, but you have to remember that the film was still in principal photography at that point. And so all we had to go from were stills shot on the various sites in Tunisia, production drawings and sketches, and any other thing that they could cobble together to make a visual while this presentation was going on. So the full impact of Star Wars visuals was still unknown at this point.
And you said none of the special effects were done.
None of the special effects didn't actually go into post-production until right after the Worldcon. So in that sense, we got a sketch, I would say, of what the film was going to look like. And Gary Kurtz and Mark Hamill and Charles Lippincott were very good about conveying to the audience that, yes, this was kind of old-fashioned space opera, but it was taken seriously. It was given the kind of respect that the genre they felt deserved.
Yeah, it was homaging that, but it was going farther.
It was homaging that, but it was going farther than that. And that's precisely, as anyone who saw Star Wars for the first time, as I did, and everyone else since, realized that's what they were doing. So the conventions was it was hard for me to gauge because I couldn't stay for the entire thing. I got a call. As being the chairman of the convention, I was always being drawn 4 or 5 different directions. But I was able to stay for enough of it that the slideshow and audio presentation was held people's attention. They were definitely interested. There might have been a few people who got up and left, but for the most part, that big audience was there until the very end, and they grilled everybody about the film in detail.
That's really interesting.
They were, and you could tell in the time period.
Was Hamill there to answer questions?
Yeah, he was there too. And remember, he was just a kid.
Yeah.
I mean, he was very young. In fact, he was going around the convention, saying, "Hi, I'm Mark Hamill, and I'm in a big Hollywood production." And people would look at him and, say, "Well, that's nice, kid."
That's so interesting.
But he was really a very nice guy, and he was a comics fan at that point.
Oh yeah,
a big comic collector. So he was not.
He campaigned to be on the Batman the Animated Series when he played the Joker. I mean,
I'm not surprised,
and
he was quite good on
him about what villains they were going to use and stuff like that. And, yeah.
Both Charles Lippincott, the executive in charge of publicity, and I should point out that he looked like a fan when he came there. He had a T-shirt on. He wasn't dressed up. He didn't look out of place. He looked like he was one of us, which immediately warmed him up to everyone who met him.
Yeah,
Gary Kurtz dressed.
I bet he did that on purpose.
Gary Kurtz dressed casually, as did Mark Hamill. And for the slideshow, they actually had made-up Star Wars T-shirts, as I recall.
Oh, okay, cool.
That they had put together just to wear. Now, at this point, I should mention that this a version of this presentation had been done at the San Diego Comic-Con a few months prior to us.
Okay.
But they did not get the big Star Wars display room and all the props and so forth.
They just got the slideshow.
And it was more or less just a presentation with a few questions, and then it was on to the next program. And the fans were interested, but I was told afterward that our audience was much more intense, much more interested, and was really the kind of hardcore audience. They thought if they could appeal to them, it would appeal to everybody, and that's
exactly what happened.
And that's what they were going for, and of course that happened. When it was done, it received a fairly good ovation, I was told. By the way, I should mention that I have all this on videotape. I have the entire presentation.
I really want to see
on
that.
video. And the original masters, which were done on 3/4-inch professional beta. I have no idea what condition they're in because they're not in storage here. They're in storage in Minneapolis, and I don't know how they've been stored in the last 35 years. I'm hoping to get them back because if Kansas City wins the 2016 WorldCon, I'm planning a big retrospective on the first Mid-Americon because it'll be 40 years exactly since the previous Kansas City WorldCon. So I thought definitely one of the stories I'm going to tell in a more condensed form is I'm going to tell the Star Wars story.
Yeah.
How Star Wars came to Kansas City 9 months before the film opened. And we got to see, quote unquote, the entire film from frame one to end of film 9 months before anyone else did in the form of narration.
If that video turns out to be in good enough shape, would you consider posting it? I mean,
yes.
putting it in its entirety.
What I want to do is I want to post a Mid-Americon 1 website which will have video links to all of the key programming events, so that you can actually watch slices or the entire things. I know I have some standard VHS transfers,
but
they were all transferred on the EP speed, which is the 6-hour format, and the video quality isn't as good as if they had been done on SP.
Yeah,
and of course those tapes now are 20 years old, and I popped one in the other day and looked at it because yes, I still have VHS capability, and
so do I.
They still look well. Just because it's an old technology doesn't mean that you still can't use it. I mean, I occasionally pop in an old cassette tape. If it's a piece
I
of
use
music.
it as a hub to plug all my old video game systems into. It's really nice for that.
It'll work for that too. But my goal is to recreate online Mid-Americon with ones and zeros. I want to be able to say everything is as it was, except you are there, more or less. And it's going to have still photographs. It'll have essays by me and other people about the various other aspects of the convention. And I'm definitely going to do a whole piece on Star Wars Comes to Kansas City, 9 months before it opens. And I want to have a video link directly to the hour-long presentation. Now, one thing I will not have unfortunately, is 20th Century Fox would not allow any of our video cameras anywhere near the Star Wars display room.
Yeah, so you didn't even get photography.
We couldn't even photograph stills. They didn't want anything getting out into the media, and so we had to sign I had to sign as chairman of the convention, an agreement to not allow anything to get out other than. Now they did give us blanket permission to record the Star Wars slideshow in presentation.
Wow,
that was done.
Did that.
And I demanded that. I said, this is part of our continuity of recording for history, the whole convention. And I said, think of it, 20, 30 years from now, this may be a very valuable document to have because this is before the movie comes out. Of course, I had no idea at that point I thought I was just blue skying something, and I was feeding him a line. But as it turned out, that's
exactly. You also had no idea
how
the technology would go to where you could make it readily available to the entire world for nothing.
For nothing. I mean, no one could have foreseen the internet in 1976.
Well, and the other thing I wanted to mention is it's also kind of interesting that they could even do a room like that because now people would have their phones and they could take pictures. And they'd never do a room like that now.
They couldn't do a room like that where they revealed so much about a big studio feature
because they would know that if they were revealing it, they would be inevitably revealing it to the universe.
It would show up on YouTube instantly. Just like stuff does from Comic-Con, every year.
Just like movie premieres.
People
can't keep their. I mean, again, security will try to keep phones out, but it doesn't.
Whenever I've gone to some of these preview screenings around, and Kansas City has a lot of them.
Yeah.
And then years ago, I used to go to all of them when I used to be able to get free tickets. I always just left my cell phone in the car. I just turned it off, left it in the
because
car.
you knew they'd ask you for it.
Even though that cell phone at that time didn't have a camera in it, some of them did, and I just said I don't want the hassle.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, getting back to the story now, there's a great postscript. The Star Wars slideshow presentation was a big hit. The display room was a big hit. 20th Century Fox was very happy with how they were received at Worldcon, and they certainly felt that it was worth the effort. And Gary Kurtz had a great time at the convention, as did Mark Hamill. Charles Lippincott was not at all I was kind of expecting a studio flack, and he wasn't like that at all. He was clearly a fan of both comics and science fiction. And I'm always sorry that I kind of lost track with him because I'd like to find out what he did later. And I would love to interview him 30 years later, for Mid-Americon to find out what his remembrances are from his side of things of the Kansas City Worldcon.
Is he still around?
I tried to get a hold of him back when the new Star Wars trilogy, the episodes 1 through 3, the prequels, were coming out, and I couldn't track him down. So I don't know. He may still be out
now,
there.
It'd be a really good time because we got 7 come out in 2015.
That's right.
That'd be the next best possible time.
And boy, there's a whole other program right there we could talk about.
Absolutely.
But the postscript to all of this is sometime in March of 1977. This is 6 months after the convention has ended. There's still post-convention business going on. There always is for Worldcons. Always are drag out. You have to keep your post office box open for a year after the convention, and there's always stuff still hanging loose and getting resolved and settled. Thank you letters and so forth. And in the mail one day, at our post office box, arrives this big package from 20th Century Fox Studios. And I thought this was probably publicity materials for the new Star Wars film, which by then everybody knew was coming.
Yeah.
At least if you were paying attention in the science fiction media, you knew it was coming. And much to my surprise, inside was a cover letter from 20th Century Fox and Charles Lippincott, and in it were VIP passes to see the first screening of Star Wars.
Oh, man.
I was stunned by receiving those. And these were very nice. These were 8.5 by 11 letterhead type passes done on a really crisp, bright white letterhead with silver embossing. These were very fancy. These were invitations.
You want to keep them.
And
did you keep them?
Well, I have a follow up to that.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Let me finish the story.
Sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay.
Every time you bring up something like that, I'm like, do you have it?
Can
I see it?
Can I see
it?
No. So I thought, and the letter said he wanted to thank 20th Century Fox wanted to thank the 34th World Science Fiction Convention for its hospitality. They were very happy with the way things went. Thanks so much, Ken. And here's a little thank you from us and 20th Century Fox Studios. And there were 40, I believe it was 40 VIP passes to go see Star Wars when the film opened. And I was literally stunned by that. Now, at that point, I knew that the movie was going to open at the old Glenwood Theater here, which was Kansas City's best movie theater at that time, out in Overland Park. Now, of course, it's long gone now, unfortunately. Had a big, huge, wide, curved screen on it. It was a wonderful place to go see Star Wars. And you can bet that all the local Worldcon committee were there to see Star Wars because they had seen the presentation, they had seen the slideshow, and of course by the time the movie opening, there was Star Wars stuff in the firmament, but not as much as you would think, like compared to today when they put the big push on for a big fantasy science fiction film. It's everywhere. I mean, it's all over the place. Star Wars wasn't like that. Star Wars actually had a more limited opening. I think it had less than 500 screens.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It was a very small opening, and how the word spread. How these large crowds showed up, I do not understand because, yes, I was following this in the media. Yes, there were some commercials on TV, and some of the early Star Wars trailers were terrible. I mean, they made it look just like a cheesy movie.
Yeah.
Honestly, I still to this day don't understand how the large crowds turned out for Star Wars, but somehow the 20th Century Fox machine got them to. Maybe it was word of mouth. Maybe our Worldcon had a little bit to do with that by spreading the word. I have no idea. But come the Memorial Day weekend opening for Star Wars, the crowds were huge at the Glenwood. Now, it was only playing at the Glenwood, so everyone in the Kansas City area, if you wanted to see Star Wars, had to go see it. And we made a choice to not see it on the opening weekend, but to go the following weekend to get the initial crowds down. What I didn't realize was that when all of us showed up at the box office and presented our passes, there were these huge lines waiting, and I thought, well, we're going to get crummy seats. That's just the way it's going to happen. I go up to the box office and show my pass, and the manager is called over because the kid doesn't know what is taking the tickets, doesn't understand what he's just been handed. And the manager says, oh, yes, I know about this. Apparently 20th Century Fox had alerted them that we would be coming to a screening of Star Wars.
He probably expected you a week earlier.
Expected us a week earlier. But we waited a week, and I'm sorry we waited a week. But by that time, following that week, the media was really, the word was starting to spread. Even in the pre-internet days, there was buzz about Star Wars. And I became very hopeful at that point that we had been given the preview of something that was going to be very popular. Now, you have to understand that what had changed in Hollywood at that point was the big cinema blockbuster, like we know of them today, had started with Spielberg's Jaws, which was 1974. And there had been one or maybe two other films that had attracted that kind of attention. So the groundwork was laid for a science fiction property to come in and be as big as Jaws, if not bigger. But most people didn't think in those kind of terms. Most of them just thought as Jaws was being analyzed as this kind of one-of-a-kind cultural phenomenon. What they didn't realize was this was a quantum shift change in what viewing audiences were expecting from movies. And so when we showed up, all of us were let in before the movie started. And everyone who had been standing in line for a long period of time, there was this buzz going down the line. They were like, who are these people? Buzz. They wondered why we were being let in ahead of everyone else. And what I didn't realize, because I hadn't read the pass that closely, was this also included all the concession that we wanted.
Really?
Everything was on 20th Century Fox.
That's hilarious.
So I went in with candy and popcorn and a big soda, because, damn it, I had earned it.
Yeah, sure.
And all of us got our soda, and we got the choice. We sat in the center row, and we took up the entire row. We had the best seats in the Glenwood Theater. And we honestly didn't know what to expect, but the buzz had already started to build up. So I was expecting something pretty good. And of course, anyone who's seen Star Wars knows what's happened next. The first scene is the counselor ship being pursued by the never-ending Star Destroyer that takes forever to get off the screen. And everyone's breath kind of collectively, intakes and then lets out. And we're off at that point. And by the time the final scene rolls, with the presentation of the medals, the audience just explodes with applause. I haven't seen a live audience react like that any time in my life that I can remember. This was a huge reception, and I thought to myself, "Wow, this was this was pretty damn good. And I turned to my friend Tom Reamy at that time and I said, I want to see this again. And of course, that's what everyone else was doing, was turning to their friends saying, I want to see this again. And it took us a little while beyond that to realize that this is what I'd been feeling. I felt changes were coming in science fiction. You could feel it. It felt it in the culture. I didn't know what that meant. In fact, at one point I could convince myself I was just being fanciful, that I was imagining all of this. But science fiction literature had certainly been undergoing a big change during the 1970s. And and it had been growing in popularity. But what I didn't realize was this was the ignition event. This blew the doors off of science fiction, off of American popular culture, and eventually world popular culture in a way that no one could have predicted. And and finally, when we got enough perspective from this, we finally realized what we had been handed 9 months earlier for the 34th Worldcon. And I sat back thanking my lucky stars that this sense of something big coming wasn't just my imagination. And of course, this had the immediate fallout effect that the science fiction and fantasy genre film was big. And that's when you saw all of the big productions starting to crank up. You saw the Star Trek franchise relaunch. Yep. And from that summer, for almost every summer thereafter, was the science fiction fantasy summer. There were always the big blockbuster genre films. And that led to the revival of superheroes in popular culture, and then the big superhero movies, and everything that's happened since 1977. Now, admittedly, Jaws was kind of the beginning of this. It laid the groundwork. But it was really Star Wars that blew the culture off of everything, and it changed everything in ways that some of the historians are even now beginning to fully understand. It changed Hollywood special effects, which were virtually dead at that point. It became special effects departments, individual special effects department, separate from the studio, started propping up all over the place. Science fiction was popular everywhere. Science fiction writers who had been receiving 5-figure advances were now getting 6- and 7-figure advances.
Wow!
And those who were positioned after Star Wars with enough publicity behind them now were becoming best-selling authors. And I attribute all of this to Star Wars. I attribute the popularity in comics, in science fiction film, in superhero films. All of this you can trace directly back to Star Wars. If Star Wars had not happened, it would be a completely different culture today. And I've often wondered why did this happen? Why then? Why that film? Well, the film was very good. The 70s and the 60s and 70s were a very cynical era. Yeah. The anti-hero film was very popular. And by the late 70s, the culture was getting tired of that. They wanted some good old-fashioned, American
it's incredibly escapist.
Yes, incredibly escapist. But it brings a sense of reality. Everything is done with hyper realism,
and it's also simple in a brilliant sort of way.
Absolutely. It appealed to people.
It appealed to every kind of person.
Every kind of person. You didn't have to be a science fiction fan to enjoy it. And as I was watching it, as it was rolling over me, some of these thoughts popped into my head, but I was too ensconced in actually the Star Wars film experience to be able to. It took me some time to get some distance from it.
Yeah.
But in looking back on it, I consider how fortunate I and Kansas City fandom was to be handed this to them 9 months before the film actually opened. Science fiction got its first preview of the big event that would change everything 9 months before it opened, and it happened right here in Kansas City.
Yeah, it's really neat.
Ironically, the Towers section of the Mielbach Hotel, where the Star Wars display room was, where we had our big, giant 35mm film festival, was unfortunately torn down, collapsed, in 1999, and a whole new Mielbach structure building built in its place. So I can't walk in and take you to the room that had the Star Wars display in it if you wanted to see where it was, because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
The only thing that exists is I have a couple of bricks from that went down to the
really?
site and stole a couple of bricks off of the, the site. I sent one of them to the fan guest of honor of the convention and inscribed it to him. And so I do have a couple of bricks. And I told the same story in more condensed form on NPR. There was an NPR live broadcast happening at Barney Alice Plaza right across from the Mielbach Hotel. And they got me in the last 10 minutes or so. And
when was that?
This was 1999.
Okay.
And it turned out that went national. And so I told the story to the NPR audience national in 1999. And this is the first time I've told it since. So if you were old enough, maybe you heard me tell the story before on NPR if you happen to be listening on that particular day.
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have you do it. I appreciate
so
it.
That's how Star Wars came to Kansas City. And we had San Diego and Kansas City had the first public previews of the thing that changed everything.
Well, and I get the sense from you hearing you talk about it that you kind of see it as a really seminal moment for you.
Oh, yes. It was a seminal moment for me because I was there when science fiction really came of age. It's when it penetrated the culture in such a way that everyone at some point would be a science fiction fan, whether they knew it or not. Now, prior to that, you have to remember there was a time period when, as a kid, I would go to a science fiction movie, and I hoped that a few scenes might be worth seeing, that would be worth going to the movie for. Or if Ray Harryhausen was doing the special effects, well, you always knew that special effects were going to be worth going to. Here was a film.
You weren't even watching it for the greater whole.
For the greater whole. Now, if the whole pig was entertaining, that was icing on the cake. You went to enjoy elements.
Well, like you and I watched them a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And that you would have gone to that, and you would have been waiting for the giant ant sequences, right?
Yes. Pretty much, because at that age in 1953, I'd have been like 5 years old. So I just wanted to see the special effects, just like your son.
Yeah, I remember Jason. He would walk away from the screen whenever people were talking, but when the giant ants came up,
when the giant ants
started,
he was right there. He was right there. So, but Star Wars was the first science fiction film that basically sucked in the entire culture, and it didn't do it just in the United States. I've said that it hit America like a sneak atomic attack.
You're right,
and that's exactly what it was like. And then it went overseas, and more atomic attacks happened, and we've now become a science fiction culture
almost globally.
And I have to tell you, the other fallout from this was we began to see the death of the American Western. Now, I'd grown up in the 1950s when every other show on television, or every other movie and movie
Thanks for mentioning that. That's a great point.
Was the American Western. And that is the film that started...
Do you think science fiction directly killed it?
I think so. I think it supplanted it. Now, the American Western is still there.
Well, we've seen somewhat of a resurgence,
yes.
But a lot of it feels to be kind of, people looking to the past and wanting to just re-experience that as opposed to innovating with it.
Or do interesting things that maybe didn't happen. But
or merge it with something else.
Or merging it with something else. So the American Western isn't dead by any means.
No, but it's nostalgic.
But is more nostalgic in nature, and you see every once in a while a Western produced. And it usually has some kind of a spin on it, like Django. Is a good one of the more recent examples.
Right, yeah.
And there have been others. There was the Jonah Hex comic-based movie, which was not very good.
But nobody saw it.
Yes, that's
the remake of True Grit.
True Grit
was popular. Yeah.
And it was a terrific film too, and it deserved all of the success.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So the American Western is by no means dead, but it does not hold the public imagination like fantasy and science fiction tropes do today. And I say that we were building toward Star Wars starting in the 1950s. You can look at the history. There's a handful of really top-notch science fiction films from the 50s, a few in the 60s, and then, of course, in the 60s we get Star Trek.
Yeah.
Now, Star Trek was not initially successful. It ran 3 seasons, but where it really became successful was when it went into syndication. That's when it started to find its audience because of all the repeats. And the Star Trek phenomenon was building at this point that Star Wars was being made, but it wasn't quite ready to take off again yet. It took another... We had Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was a big hit at the time, but was quite a departure from the type of science fiction film that had been seen before. So there had been science fiction films, and remember another thing that was happening in our culture was the American space program.
Yeah.
The popularity of the American space program made us space conscious. And after the final Apollo missions, and then we graduated to the Skylab missions, and then eventually to the International Space Station and the shuttle, that space consciousness and Star Trek and the science fiction films of the 50s and the 60s and 2001: Space Odyssey had been laying the groundwork, the science fiction groundwork for something like Star Wars to come along. And Star Wars had the right combination of everything to appeal to everyone. And that's why it was the ignition event that blew the doors off of our culture, like I've said. And if Star Wars hadn't been the film that it was, I don't know if what we saw happen would have happened in precisely the same way.
I don't think it would have the same way.
I'm not convinced.
It could have happened in some sort of... I mean, I still feel like you would have had science fiction films because you were still space conscious, but also, of course, as you know, Star Wars is more of a science fantasy film than it is a science fiction film, which is, I think, also part of why it had the global success it did, because, again, it appealed to more... It didn't feel too cerebral.
It was fantasy with lots
of... It's not that it's stupid, it's just that more people felt like they could appreciate it.
And more importantly, it laid to rest the anti-hero, at least for a while, in American film culture, which the 60s and the 70s were full of.
I mean, I think we had a lot by the mid-80s, too, but it at least reminded us that we could do something that was more just straight up, this is good, this is evil, more of an idealized kind of universe.
Now, I don't know if your readers know that, did I mention earlier that George Lucas wanted to do Flash Gordon? I think I mentioned that.
You did, yeah.
And a good thing that he didn't get the rights to that, because it would have been a completely different film.
You know, I was going to mention that. I think it's kind of fascinating, too, that we were talking about how the Western has kind of made a resurgence, but it's really nostalgic. Well, Star Wars was, too, except that it innovated. Except that it was something that we had never seen before, but it was a callback to those old science fiction serials. And because he wanted to do Flash Gordon, clearly, he just wanted to go back and remake a thing that had been done before.
That was kind of Flash Gordon live.
Kind of, yeah. And what's funny is if he had gotten the rights to Flash Gordon, I am convinced they wouldn't have made anything like the kind of film they made.
No, they wouldn't have. And about the only thing that, there are several tropes that remain from the Flash Gordon shows, particularly the final serial, Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe, has the perspective scroll that tells you what's happened up to now, that opens Star Wars. Well, that's right out of Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe. And so that's...
And, of course, his original draft, as we're finding now, as Dark Horse is putting it out in comic book form. Right. I don't know if you're reading that.
No, I'm not.
It's really interesting. You see the way they have envisioned that it looks a lot more like Flash Gordon.
Does it really?
Yeah, and like the Emperor wears something that looks like the bad guys in that did, complete with the shoulder pads and like the big sun on the chest, and it's really colorful and that sort of thing.
Boy, that's Alex Raven's Flash Gordon, all right.
Yeah.
Even when Al Williamson was doing the Flash Gordon comic reboot in the late 1960s, they were following that look, that style of Alex Raven. And of the three Flash Gordon serials, Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe is the most like the actual Flash Gordon comic strip in terms of its costuming, the type of costuming, the tale that it tells. It's much more reminiscent than the two earlier serials, in my opinion.
Real briefly before we finish, if you don't mind, I'd like to just talk about Star Wars in general for a second.
Sure.
You from your perspective back then, you having had that really unique perspective on it and seeing it the way you did, knowing what the story was before you walked into it, how did you feel about the sequels when they finally came out?
Well, I really enjoyed The Empire Strikes Back a lot, and in fact,
did you think that it supplanted the original? That it was better than the original?
I actually did, and usually the middle trilogy is sometimes the weakest. But I think the director chosen and the screenwriter chosen did just exactly what they needed to turn it a little bit darker, to make it a little bit more serious.
Yeah.
And of the original trilogy, Empire Strikes Back is my favorite of the three.
Yeah, it's mine too.
Now, when we get to the Return of the Jedi, I was somewhat disappointed in the original theatrical release of Jedi.
Well, I was going to ask you if you were on the bandwagon of they messed up the ending.
Well, yeah, I was. And in fact, when Lucas went through and redid it and cut some of the Wookiee sequences, not the Wookiee sequences, but the
Ewoks.
The Ewoks, excuse me, out and added some of the additional stuff, I thought that raised it a half a star.
Oh, really?
And I think that is a slightly better story.
Okay.
It feels more satisfying. But that said, it's still not as satisfying as I was hoping the film would be. But Lucas kind of set a difficult task for himself, because I'm quite certain when he started with Star Wars, he never expected it to be a trilogy.
No.
He was going to tell a straightforward, good guys are defeated by the bad guys are defeated by the good guys. Roll credits.
Yeah.
Roll credits.
And I think part of the reason that it feels like a planned trilogy in a lot of ways is because Empire is as good as it is. I think it's because Empire recognized that if you're going to make it a three-part story, your middle part needs to be where the really gripping conflict happens. That's how stories. You're beginning, a middle, and an end. The middle part is where the rough stuff ought to happen.
And I tell you, when after that second film, I couldn't wait for the third film.
Yeah.
And I just hoped that Lucas wouldn't drop the ball, but he really did set himself an impossible task.
Yeah, I think it's still a good movie.
It's a good movie,
but I think it's also really difficult to end something like that. In the most satisfying way. You mentioned earlier that sometimes the second part of a trilogy is the weakest. I think most of the time the third part is the weakest.
Well, we've certainly seen that
especially
happen.
had that a lot with more recent trilogies and with a lot of superhero trilogies.
Well, the latest Batman trilogy is a good example of that. You and I have similar feelings about
I felt that way, and I mean, some people don't. And I understand that, but
sure.
But yeah, I mean, I don't hate Rises, but I certainly don't think it's as good as the first two, if nothing else.
But I'll give one thing. I'll give Lucas this.
Yeah.
If we didn't have Star Wars and the original trilogy, we'd have nothing of what we get today.
Yeah.
Look at the box office numbers. Star Wars is when science fiction and fantasy genre films began to dominate film.
That's right.
In general. And they still do.
Yeah,
they make the biggest box office. Sometimes they make the biggest duds too.
Well, and you'll notice a lot of things that you wouldn't immediately think would be genre films end up being genre films.
Exactly.
You get up that a lot.
And now you look at what's being on television.
Look at Downey's Sherlock Holmes movies; those are superhero films.
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right. You're one of the few people who agrees with me on that.
Those are superhero films.
Absolutely.
Straight up.
I mean, with all the action that's happening in those films and all that fantastical stuff,
Sherlock Holmes goes and breaks. I mean, he's a vigilante. He breaks into people's houses, and
he's a superhero without costume. Well, of course, his deerstalker hat's kind of costume.
He's at least got an iconic get up. Yeah.
Get up, yes, and anyone who wears any kind of an iconic get, like you and I were talking about before the broadcast, and they fight crime in any form. That's a superhero. That's the definition of a superhero. So you can have lots of superheroes without bright costumes who are still superheroes, and there you are. So we thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks for coming, Ken.
I hope we can do this together.
Delightful.
I would love to talk about some of the early days of comics fandom.
Yeah,
what it was like to be a
I'm glad you gave us an introduction to that.
Yeah.
And
well, I want your readers, your listeners, to know that I'm just not some stuffy science fiction fan. That
right? Yeah, no, I really appreciate you doing that. That's great.
As I said, the Wild Card series, which I recommended early in this interview, is dedicated to me by George R. R. Martin, and it's dedicated to Ken Keller, who grew from the same 4-color roots as me.
Oh, I didn't know he dedicated.
Yes, he did it, and I take that dedication to heart because I'm very proudful of the fact that my friend Edmund Lowe made me a comics fan. And it's something that if I could meet him today, I'd thank him so much for that, because the experiences that I've had as a result of that have been amazing, and it's been an amazing life, at least so far.
Well, Ken, come back again.
Please, I will love to come back anytime you want. Any topic that you want, I can hold forth on just about everything.
Oh,
as your listeners can tell.
I'd love to do pulp heroes. I'd love to do Shadow.
Do the Shadow, pulp heroes, science fiction.
On, do the Shadow.
We can talk about fandom and its permutations, anything along those lines. In fact, I'd love to do a round robin with you and a couple of your other guests, and we could have a whole panel discussion.
Oh, that'd be great.
On the topic.
Maybe I could bring somebody. You could bring somebody.
Sky's the limit.
Yeah.
Let's sure do this again.
We'll do it again. Well, everybody, thanks as always for listening to Geeks Not Nerds, the podcast. I'm Captain Logan, and this was Ken Keller. Say goodbye, Ken.
Goodbye, and thanks for listening.